Hello, everybody, and welcome to Break the Rules, Sowing Discourse with Jeffrey Tucker, Editorial Director at the American Institute for Economic Research, Austrian economy. This is something very close to my heart. It is a great pleasure to have you here with us, and also joining us is Dr. Edward Hudgens and my wonderful co-host, Jules P. Hamilton. Everybody, please subscribe, and also don't forget to go to patreon.com/breaktherules with a 3. And if you give $20 as a patron, you are going to get an exquisite print from our good friend Gio Panicetti, who's going to be joining us later on today. So without further ado, Jeffrey, thank you so much for being here. I have one quick question to get us started, which is, what was the impetus to get you from going into music in college to going into economics?
Hey, can I first say hi to Ed Hudgens? I can't believe it's you over there. I'm looking like this, like, oh my God, my old friend. Oh my God. It's so fantastic.
Tell everybody about this.
What is it? Oh, Human Action. I've heard of that book.
Mises.
Mises or Mises? What's the right way to say it?
Mises.
Mises Pieces.
Mises Pieces.
And we are also joined by Derek from Burning Boots Podcast. Welcome, Derek.
Hello. Thanks for having me on, man.
You're welcome. So, Jeffrey, let's get us started about the switch from music to economics.
Oh, yeah. So it's actually funny because my father was he was a historian, but he was also a fanatical musician too. I mean, he's like a composer and a singer and a trombonist and guitar player, all this stuff. And so he kind of got me into music in a young age. And I had a weird musical family. We used to sing the complete score of a Messiah as a family around the living room during Christmas. So just to show you how weird that was. But he stuck a trombone in my hand when I was in second grade, and I became very good. And then by seventh grade, I was pretty awesome. And then by ninth grade, I was just like killing it. And
Nice.
You know, people were flying in to teach me for free, kind of stuff. And by my junior year in high school, I was playing for the Texas Tech trombone ensemble. I was playing first chair in the first section anyway in the jazz band, and I started touring with the Guy Lombardo Orchestra, you know, as a kind of professional trombonist. And so I was kind of like, I thought that was all I was destined to do. I thought I was that guy, you know. And then there was just one day, it was like very strange that I imagined I could do something else. You know, it was just like, wait, do I have to be this guy? And so then I kind of did some tests, and I used to hang around the music department at Texas Tech. I graduated from high school pretty early, and I used to hang around the musicians at Texas Tech. And one day I noticed something about them, that they were kind of, now keep in mind, the jazz musicians were wonderful people, for the most part. I mean, irresponsible, and as you're supposed to be as a jazz musician. But
Jazz is the original punk.
yeah, that's right. But everybody else was kind of like super serious, and it was a serious music department. And if you're going to be a music major, you have to hang around all these people and go to all their dreary, overly serious concerts and everything. And the thing I realized is that most of these people are super miserable because they had not come to terms with consumer culture, and all these musicians, these professional musicians, resent their audiences for failing to like the music that they like. You know, they're all supposed to like all the newest compositions that sound like crap, and so they're always mad at their audiences for wanting to hear Haydn and Mozart. And so they're not ever paid enough, you know. And they go to somebody's house for a party, and they're like, "Hey, can you sit down and play piano?" And they're like, "Well, how much are you going to pay me?" Musicians have this kind of crabby attitude towards the commercial culture, and it turned out, even though I love going to the symphony, and I love listening to symphonic music and everything else, the people who are actually involved in that world are actually kind of dreary people and depressing to be around. And I thought, you know, I don't much like these people. I went over to the economics department. Everybody was kind of joyful and fun and happy, and they're talking about cool things and how to improve the world, and thrilled about commercial society and material goods, and explaining things like prices and profits. And, you know, I thought, wait, I love this subject. This is an exciting, happy, hopeful subject. Maybe I can bring some of the skills I learned in the world of music in terms of creativity and blah, 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 into the realm of economics. And so I did the switch, and that was it.
But it
I've
was
tried to stay involved in music, though. I have stayed involved. I conducted a choir for 10 years anyway. And,
wow.
But
What
so,
kind of music?
Well, thank you for asking. Weird answer is that it was mostly Gregorian chant and medieval polyphony.
I was about to ask you about those chants. I remember you were talking about merging them with Lady Gaga and creating a new style of Lady Gaga Gregorian chant music. But you also
I think it's time.
It definitely
We're
is
ready.
time. We are ready. But it's an interesting thing though, because you went to economics, but mostly it was Keynesian economics. It was not Austrian by any means. So what got you into Austrian economics?
Well, so yeah, I took all these economics classes, and I love them really. I mean, I just like the subject, you know. But there wasn't a lot of in those days anyway, with all the sort of the mechanistic ISLM curves and big aggregates crashing into each other and all this weird modeling and everything. There wasn't a lot of sort of human purpose behind it. It wasn't very fleshy, you know. It was a little bloodless. So I had a roommate who had this book by Hans Sinholtz called Age of Inflation, and I read it. And it told the story of the Weimar inflation. And I thought, well, look at that. See, you get the money system wrong and you destroy society. And then next thing you know, you got Hitler and the whole map of Europe turns black. So economics is about institutions and about reforms and about integrity and freedom and that sort of thing. And so then I just followed the footnotes. There was no internet in those days. Yes, I was born before the internet, and so I had to follow all the footnotes. So I followed the footnotes to Mises, you know, and so I really threw myself into reading Mises, and you know, you just fall in love, you know, and it's like, well, this adds an extra element to economics that I really find fascinating and beautiful. So yeah, that was that, and God, here I am all these years later, still kind of just as in love with economics and the Austrian school in particular, as I was then. You know, I should also have to give some credit to Ayn Rand too, because when I was in high school, I used to read Rand, and which is great. And she kind of infused me with a sense of excitement about commercial society, markets, business, and serious thinking too. You know, Rand does that for you, and I've carried that with me all my life too. And then I also have to credit Murray Rothbard, with whom I had a 10-year friendship that was very exciting and fun. We used to go to concerts together and hang out all the time. We were on the phone several times a week. And
you were writing for his publication, right? The Rothbard, Lou Rockwell. There was a newsletter that went out back in the day.
Yeah. That was a little bit of a dicey publication, and Lou would sometimes run my essays. In fact, I think I wrote a big article on jazz music that caused all kinds of frenzy when it came out. So, but I worked with Murray very closely at the Mises Institute on I was editing their monthly newsletter and the website and that sort of thing. And then now Murray died in 95. So I got to know him in 85, and he died in 95, right as the web browser was invented. So he never really got to see the World Wide Web as it developed. But I put a lot of energy and effort into putting all of Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises online.
I'm sure everybody's really thankful for that. I was reading Anatomy of the State. That is a great read, and I wonder what he would say today with everything that's going on related to the internet and free speech and also copyright, which I know is a big issue for you as well. You did a whole presentation about how when it comes to patent law and things like that, this has been slowing so much progress. And Jules, for example, has been talking a lot with me about how much the FDA has slowed down progress when it comes to medical care, life extension, things of that nature.
Yeah, well, it's Murray had some sympathy for copyright. I think he would have been talked out of it by now, but he never liked patents, and patents are the ones that really impede progress and industrial progress, and especially in the pharmaceutical realm. My goodness, I noticed with all the hysteria trying to get a vaccine and therapeutics for COVID that all these rules are being relaxed. I hope we can stick with that sort of liberalization after this passes.
Yeah. It's interesting, Jeffrey. One of the things I've done in the last 3 years, I recently left the Heartland Institute, and a lot of my work had been done on the Food and Drug Administration, looking at the fact that it was created, the current system to certify both safety and efficacy, which is this very loose definition, was created in 1962. We now have exponential technology that has little or nothing to do with double-blind placebo tests. For example, last April, the Food and Drug Administration issued a call for comments on how to regulate artificial intelligence software as a medical device. And you go, what, a medical device? What is that? Well, they've got this round hole, and so they've got the square peg that's artificial intelligence software, and they just got to figure out how to stick it into that round hole because that's what they've got. You know, this is the same FDA, by the way, that in the 90s classified essentially a urine specimen cup, that's not it, that's a coffee cup, as a medical device, a Class C medical device in the same category as a heart valve. And the court knocked that one down. But I'm just pointing out that Jeffrey is kind of right on the mark. Interestingly enough, at the end of February, just before the whole COVID thing hit, I was at the Food and Drug Administration headquarters, which is not far from where I live here in Rockville, Maryland. And I was saying for a meeting about reform, the pre-arranged meeting, I said, no, guys, I've been getting these stories about how your regulations are slowing down and stopping private laboratories from coming out with test kits and all these kind of things, because it looks like this COVID thing might be really serious. And it looks like your regulations are getting in the way. Guess what?
Well, I have a question for Jeffrey Tucker. In terms of the free market, what do you think a hypothetical unregulated environment would look like? Because that tends to scare a lot of people when they think about this Pandora's box of CRISPR or biotech, genetic engineering. If people could just do whatever they want, like how do you reassure people that an unregulated market would yield better prices than what Bernie Sanders proposes, which is like, how do we make healthcare free for everyone?
Yeah. Well, if our last 6 months have taught us anything, I think it should be that we don't want the state involved in medicine at all. Actually, look what a catastrophe they've created over the last 6 months. It's been a disaster, like Professor Hutchins mentions about the testing fiasco by itself was a disaster, and that's probably what led to the lockdowns. Everybody's panicked because you couldn't find out if you had this weird new thing called the coronavirus or not, and so people are like, well, what can we do? We have to shut down the freedom. The state has mismanaged this so badly, and part of the problem is that everything that the state does is like imposed centrally, and then they're very reluctant to admit mistakes. I don't think a single health official in this country or a single governor or politician has admitted to having made any mistakes over the last 6 months. So the beautiful thing about the free market is that it's always testing all the time. And if there are mistakes and there are errors and there are mess ups, but they're limited in scope and they're correctable. And society has a right to choose, and people can compete with each other. So you get, in the end, a much better product. It seems a little counterintuitive, but if you want high quality and an orderly society, you have to permit freedom, the freedom to fail and mistakes to take place because they're easily corrected under circumstances of freedom. People are intelligent, and freedom allows you to use your critical intelligence, whereas government, as we've learned now, just locks you down, makes you stay home in your room, keeps you from going to the theater and to Broadway and to baseball and to the bars. So this is what government does. I think we're much better off under freedom.
How much would you also?
I just wanted to also kind of respond to say that, like, the purpose of law is not to try to increase economic activity or incentives or motivations or anything like that. It should be to to enforce or protect, private property rights. It should be consistent with property rights. And so I don't think that any argument specifying that the government should do this, enact this law or enact that law, to maybe spur innovation in this sector of the economy, or maybe slow it down over here, is just not the function of law as I see it. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find any legal theory that would say otherwise.
It's one of the great shocks of my life was, living over the last 6 months. It was early March when the South by Southwest conference was canceled by the Austin, Texas mayor. And I thought, wait a minute. You can't do that. You can't just steal a conference. You can't just abolish a conference, negate everybody's contracts, rob everybody of their property rights, make their plane tickets and the hotel reservations null and void. I mean, this is an appalling attack on freedom and property. And I couldn't believe they got away with it. And I was also shocked at how little public outrage there was towards it. I was screaming about that at the time.
And by the way, they did the same. They did the same thing, of course, for Freedom Fest in Las Vegas. And it was like a week and a half before. I always go to Freedom Fest, Jeffrey, I know you know it very well. And then suddenly all these contracts, all of this stuff that they had worked for, they tried to abide by everything. Well, we want social distancing. We want this, we want that. And then at some point, the governor just, no, boom, that's it.
Yeah, that was absolutely outrageous. That was so tragic, and there's no compensation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like the Fifth Amendment says you can't take private property without just compensation. I mean, state governments have done this to millions, tens of millions of people and businesses all over the country for the last 6 months. There's no talk about compensation. I mean, every bit of this stuff is absolutely unconstitutional. It's outrageous. I felt terrible for what happened to Mark Skousen.
Yeah.
How much
we did go ahead with PorcFest this year, which was interesting because they kind of canceled it, and then everybody was like, "No, let's just go to the campground anyway and have a quote PorcFest unquote." Well, 400 people showed up, and we had the best PorcFest we'd ever had. And guess what? A survey afterwards. This was like, I think in May, or maybe it was June. A survey afterwards asked a very simple question, which nobody asks these questions anymore. Did you get sick? Now this like, are you asymptomatic COVID positive? No, the question is, did you get sick? And there wasn't a single person that reported having gotten sick from that event. And there were 400 of us. There was no distancing or masks or anything else. We just acted like normal people. Not anybody got sick.
Yeah, it was the same story with the. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, man.
No, I just want to ask, what exactly is PorcFest? Does it involve like a greased pig running around and people chasing it, or?
That should be an event at PorcFest.
Yeah. So they call it PorcFest because it's like the Porcupine Freedom Fest or something like that. Yeah,
Gotcha.
because it's in New Hampshire, and it's just a kind of a big camping thing. I don't camp, but I stayed in a little hotel, But I love going because I think Ed has been there, right? But it's a wonderful thing because I had like 300 people come to my 2-hour-long lecture, and they actually paid attention. So yeah, I was just really happy about it.
Was it pretty impeded? I've never been, but did people actually, stay home this year, and it was turnout impeded?
The turnout was good. I think
Really?
it's been bigger in the past. I think it's been bigger in the past. But
I went to the Libertarian National Convention, and it was pretty impeded. And it was still fun, but I mean. Yeah, and then it was the same story there. Hardly anyone wore masks, man. I don't think anybody got sick.
Nah. It's just crazy. The virus behaves like a virus, and we've all learned about viruses over the last 6 months, and learned there's something you encode into your immune system. You shouldn't be afraid of it if you're healthy. Get out there, get it done. I mean, we've evolved with viruses. We've learned this, and we certainly learned the governments and their weird plans for our lives don't do anything to suppress a virus. I think we've learned a lot.
Well, we've also learned about the media as well. This languid response from the people, I don't think it's just in a vacuum. I think that the media response has been very instrumental in making people perceive this, as well as many of the other events that have occurred this past year, in a particular light. And I wouldn't necessarily say that these are bastions of the free market if we're talking about 6 corporations owning most of the media. So when it comes to something like that, what exactly is the solution?
Oh, you know, I'm so glad you brought this up because it's been an absolute scandal and still is, you know. On March, let me have to think about the date. No, it was February 27th. I was listening to my favorite morning podcast, the New York Times Daily. And I've always loved the New York Times. I know it's got problems. But I was listening to it, and suddenly they're whipping up a kind of a frenzy. They're saying that here comes the virus. It's just like Spanish flu. 3.8 million Americans are going to die. What? If you have 6 friends, one of them is going to be dead from COVID, said this podcast. I was listening to this, and I thought, you know, this is not what the New York Times said in 1968-69 or 2006 or 1957-58 or 1949 or 1952. The New York Times has always counseled calm. If you get sick, go to your doctor. Otherwise, keep social functioning going. I thought there is something up here, and whatever the New York Times spreads like a virus to every other media outlet. So the next day, I shut it off, and along with the television and everything else, and I haven't turned it on ever since. And now I get my news mainly through Twitter, and I adhere to the data, and I'm all the time on looking at all the data sites, and I read financial pages, and I'm very, very careful about the information that goes in my brain because I want to say sensible, meaningful, true things. And if you clog your head full of media BS all day, you'll be absolutely hopeless.
Yep. And Lev, I want to. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, first, I also wanted to say that Gio Panichetti is joining us as well. Welcome, Gio. So,
hey.
Yeah,
Ciao,
this is
Gio.
great. I remember
Come
Jeffrey
stai?
Tucker from back. Hey, how's it going? I remember Jeffrey from back when I was a libertarian many moons ago. So,
well, we're gonna get into that.
hopefully.
So Dr. Hudgens, what were you saying?
Oh, yeah. I just want to add something to the point you make. I don't think it's just a matter of who owns the media, but my argument has been this, and you heard maybe a little bit of this on another show. I argue that right now we are literally on the verge with exponential technology of ushering in an age of incredible prosperity, long, healthy, maybe even unlimited transhuman lives. That's how good things are. I mean, you talk about Murray Rothbard dying just as the internet was coming in, right? And just when exponential technology and telecom was coming in, look what's happening in biotech now. The cost of sequencing a human genome went from 100 million in 2001 to 10 million in 2007. It's under $1,000 today. I could do a whole show on just the incredible stuff. And in fact, I've just started an organization, the Human Achievement Alliance, which is going to be highlighting these issues. But here's the other thing. For the last certainly couple of decades, higher education especially has been dominated by not only the left, but the postmodernists, there's no objective reality, it's your narrative versus my narrative, this kind of nonsense. And they have indoctrinated a whole generation that now are in leadership positions in media, in entertainment, in religion, in civic organizations, in corporate boards, certainly in politics, and obviously in education. And so that's why, for example, the sort of brilliant papers that Jeffrey here has done and that I have done, our audience in a sense is shrinking because the long march, the left's long march through the institutions has to a great extent succeeded. So it's not just that the media is controlled by certain, by 6, groups or whatever. It's that you've got this indoctrinated class that runs it that just cannot even think out of their own dogmas. I encounter this all the time.
Basically, most of us are fucking stupid.
Well, these people
I don't know. I kind of disagree with that a little bit.
They're completely indoctrinated. This is the problem. Yeah. They get out of these universities where they've been fed a bunch of nonsense in their literature humanities classes. Actually,
they're in debt. They're in debt from taking feminist tap dancing lessons.
Because the government basically underwrites loans so they can go spend 4 years going to college, getting drunk and laid, and then suddenly they've got these huge debts. They basically have that they can't pay back because they've got a degree that's worth nothing. And so they all go out and vote for Bernie Sanders, even though before the recession and before the coronavirus, there was 1.6 million job openings more than there were unemployed Americans, because we've had this incredible disconnect between the government-dominated schooling system and the needs of the market decade after decade.
Yeah, that's right.
Jeffrey, I have go ahead.
Well, I just want to add about the New York Times. They're performing coups, little coups at all these institutions, right? So this happened to the New York Times. After Trump was elected 4 years ago, they brought in an op-ed editor to diversify their pages and to add a greater degree of voices. And they apologized, actually, to the country. We missed the mood of the country. We're the newspaper of record. We're supposed to reflect the reality on the ground here. So we're going to change our coverage and be a little more balanced. And so they did. Well, that didn't last long. There was a coup. The guy was fired. The new op-ed editor was fired, and all of his writers with him. And they've been driving people out. There's been a complete coup at the New York Times now, so that now the paper has become absolutely unreadable. It's just become a critical theory daily with all these wild SJW fanatics. And it's just a propaganda rag at this point. Whereas even 8 months ago, it was still readable. Now it's an impossible. It's a disgusting thing. They tried the same thing at the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal just completely said, you know what, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. The editorial page said, you guys can just take a hike. We're never going to go the way of the New York Times.
Well, I don't know how long.
I have a question.
Yes.
So earlier, it sounded like you said you filter the information you take in because it's important to enrich yourself. But is it possible that if you're in a position to possibly persuade or be persuaded by someone on the far left, that they could dismiss you as someone that cultivates an echo chamber?
I hope not. I try to, but when I say that I'm really careful about what goes in my head, which is to say, I don't want to be manipulated by anyone. So I have friends of mine whose phone is always going bling, 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 bling with the latest news nonsense. And they don't realize that they're just being manipulated by a third party. And I always encourage people to turn off all the notifications so they don't get constantly alarmed with the latest nonsense. I'm really careful. I try to be more discerning in the kind of news that I read. So I don't eschew the New York Times completely, but I'm careful to not allow my brain to be manipulated by forces I don't understand. I'm trying to.
Yeah, it was only like maybe 5 or 6 months ago that Google all of a sudden just started sending me news updates that I didn't ask for about like what's going on with like Donald Trump's family. You know, oh, he went golfing this weekend. Like, what? I didn't ask for any of this stuff.
Yeah,
like, I don't care.
Yeah, Apple News is the same thing. Everybody's trying to eat your brain, and your phone is the portal through which they do that. So get control of your notifications. I would recommend to people to shut them all off, with the exception of SMS. And then guess what? You can have a peaceful life, and maybe you can bring back your critical intelligence and have time to read, for example. That's a good thing. So the lockdown period has been very good for me in a sense that I feel like I've gotten much better and much more disciplined about managing information flows in and out. And as a result, I've become, I think, a better writer and a better thinker.
Have you seen the interview with Yuri Bezmenov back in the day, the former KGB propagandist? And now recently there's been a big resurgence about him because of the video game Call of Duty. They used that interview in their trailer. So one of his quotes is...
it may have been fake, by the way. That was another issue.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, he said...
that he wasn't actually a KGB agent, but, you know.
Well, the kind of things that he says, though, it does resonate. As far as my family, we come from the USSR originally. And when they saw the interview with him, the things he said, there wasn't anything there that surprised them. It's very obvious to them that back in the 60s, there was a lot of funding that was going to the professors, to Antifa. Antifa is still funded today, partly by Russia as well as other elements. But the point that I'm getting to here is I wanted to read something that I wrote down in preparation to talk with you, Jeffrey, which is this, and I think this would also tie into something that Gio may be interested in talking about. So, I understand that you are not in favor of using the authority of the state to squash freedoms in order to guarantee other freedoms. For example, giving dictatorial power to a strongman who would physically remove all socialist professors and activist judges and journalists. However, do you see the indoctrination through governmental and multinational institutions, media, and academia as being effective enough over time as to raise up the specter of totalitarianism should nothing be done to stand in their way?
I hope so. Well, it has to. I don't see we have any choice. I don't trust the state policing our ideological landscape at all. I think it should be completely hands off. And I think if we do have freedom of speech, we can eventually overcome dictatorship, but it takes constant, unrelenting fighting, and people like us to be out there talking and writing and getting the truth out there. I think there's a growing consciousness in this country of the need for alternatives to big tech, actually, to Facebook. Do you remember a time, by the way, when Facebook seemed vaguely valuable? I do.
Now it's all
I still think
memes.
it's valuable. I love Facebook.
Jules is a Facebook stan.
I'm
Oh,
a Facebook.
God.
I'm a Facebook fan because of family stuff. I've got a huge extended family, so here's what the ones in Connecticut are doing. Oh, look, a new
Yeah.
baby, isn't that
That's the
cute?
right way.
I just put a fake name, baby. A fake name. And I just use Messenger for friends and family. I have no desire for it anymore. I'm scared of it even sometimes.
But
No,
and
we're
actually,
doing more.
if you do, you can get into. I am in some very good Facebook sites for very focused sort of things, especially in technology. Exponential tech, the sort of thing. I have my own thing. I'm getting beefed up now. So there are advantages.
That's right. You just got to be careful and curate it. I'm just not being good at curating my Facebook experience. I've just kind of blown it off at this point, because it's too weird. The other thing is, I think a lot of my friends sort of grew up, I maxed out like 5,000, like about 6 years ago or something. And they're probably like too many political people, and there's been too much political chaos and everything. And generally, I don't even like politics, actually, So
Jeffrey, one other thing though that you brought up that's I think an important point, and the quote that you had, Lev. By the way, Lev, when did your family come over?
We came over in 1993, so we were lucky enough to get the right bureaucrats to take a look at our paperwork, so that we had some family over here. So I'm so thankful we were. I love America.
Good.
I love this country, regardless of whatever problems it has.
I was there in '81 at the first time, and then I was there in December of '89 and December of '90 with the Heritage Foundation's first free market conference behind the Iron Curtain. So I was literally on the ground doing that at the time. But here's the point about free speech, which of course obviously I agree about. But one of the problems we've seen lately is the cancel culture. And you probably saw that poll, Jeffrey, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, that said that people who are sort of conservative, right, whatever you say, and I'm not talking about Nazis, I'm talking about, sort of moderate people, are scared to put their opinions forward. I'll give my wife as an example. She's a freelance editor for a major publishing company. She's libertarianish conservative. And she sees all the crap that goes into textbooks that go into the universities. And she sees that she's got to be very careful in her editing. Because, for example, one of the things that literally just came down is, do you capitalize the word black if you're talking about a black American as opposed to a white American or anything else? They have just ruled that you have to capitalize black, I can go through and give you all of these politically correct things, and she's very careful about how she pushes back because she knows that this doesn't make any sense from a style perspective, a consistency perspective, but she's got to be careful, expressing those opinions. Now, of course, I can say whatever the hell I want, and I do, but
for now. Well,
for now, yeah.
Here's a book that I would highly recommend everybody to read if you have not done so yet. It's called The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. And that book talks about how we are living under two different systems of law, where the First Amendment was supposed to guarantee freedom of association, but with the civil rights laws that got passed in the 60s, this is not the case. So to sum it up in one quote from the book, one's bias is held to be part of the unconscious of human nature. there are no areas of the human life in which the state's vigilance is not called for. And that is the disturbing thing for me, as far as, like, Jeffrey, you were talking about the Wall Street Journal not really going the direction of the New York Times right now. I see it as just another domino that is just about to fall but hasn't yet, because there is no stopping entropy once it goes into effect, if, legally speaking, there is not anything that can be done about it if we're under two different systems of law.
No, I'm not that pessimistic, but and I tell you what, I have gained such an appreciation for the Wall Street Journal over the last 6 months, because they were the sole dissenting voice in the American press, I'd say the mainstream American press, right?
They were going after PewDiePie, though. They were turning him into a Nazi, which is something that a lot of these journalists love to do lately.
That was probably the news page, but the editorial page.
Oh man,
there's a big difference between the news page and the editorial page over there. But the editorial page has been just tremendous. I mean, they even like April 2nd, they published a huge blast against lockdowns and just said, look, we have to open this economy up. This is crazy. We got to stop this. And so they've been unrelenting throughout. And I'm so grateful for them. These have been tough times, to try to find anybody. And the press has just been so grotesque. And it's hard to know exactly why. I have friends of mine tell me that the entire thing really comes down to kind of a whipping up a public frenzy to destroy the economy so that Trump won't get elected in November. And Gabby, that's an incredible claim. If that's true, that's some really cynical journalism right there. And plus, it doesn't seem to be working anymore.
Well, we'll see about that after what happened yesterday. I think there is a backlash. By the way, I think you're right that because I know a lot of never Trumpers who are kind of conservative libertarian, and I could go over, you and I would probably completely agree on the problems with his trade policy. You and I would completely agree on a whole lot of things. We'd also completely agree with him on cutting taxes, cutting regulations, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so we have mixed views. But when I look at the never Trumpers and so forth, and then I look at the other side, because I am seeing their dogma, I think it's absolutely correct that if Trump came up with a cure for cancer personally, because he did it in his bathroom, they would say, well, but look, it's unequally applied, and only white people get. I think it really is that bad, and so anything they can do to make Trump look bad, they'll do it. And forget about what we said last week or last month. No one's going to remember it anyway. Now we've changed our minds. And
there is such a thing as Trump derangement syndrome. I mean, I agree with it. I mean, I wrote an entire book against the ideology that Trump represents, right? But on the other hand, you look at the opposition. I mean, this guy Biden, I mean, he says casually in an interview a week or so ago that he would shut the entire economy down if the doctors told him to do it. What the hell?
Yeah.
I mean, so Fauci, whispers in his ear, shut down the economy. He's going to do it, and he says that he's going to do this, and you want to be president, and you want people to vote for you, and you're talking about destroying their lives again.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, Jeffrey, I'm going to put in the chat room. I put a couple of things. I did a piece a little while ago on Ezekiel Emanuel. You probably know who he is. And the rest of you guys might. He was the guy who came up with, he was the architect of Obamacare. And he did a piece, I think it was in the Atlantic about 4 or 5 years ago, and I'll put the link in the chat room in a minute, where he said, I hope to die when I'm 75 years old. And he made this argument. He's saying, I don't want to kill everybody. But one of the things he said in that piece is we should, he quoted somebody saying we should welcome a flu and a virus because it kills old people. I will put it in there. You can read the quote. And he is Biden's advisor on the coronavirus.
Wow.
Oh, amazing.
I do want to tie something together. And I think I may have found a recipe for having productive conversations with people who might be indoctrinated by postmodernism or the far left.
Fighting crayon.
But I don't really think it's postmodernism, Jules. That's the problem. I don't.
So there's a lot of nuance to get into, and it's not a one size fits all thing. It's a technique, and it's a human self-interest argument, because I think a lot of young people who are in a lot of debt, they kind of perceive they're becoming the new serfs. They're not going to be property owners in most cases, and the middle class is shrinking. And so people have a new existential concern, and they want the government. They kind of want the government to be there to provide healthcare. And so there's a lot of people in New York that will be very hostile or perceive a free market position as very callous. If you talk about Milton Friedman, I know there were people I know close to speaking with people that work at the Young Turks. And when they heard people were fond of Milton Friedman, their idea was, well, these people just must be very callous. They don't care if someone is sick, and if someone is ill, they don't want someone to step in and help them. We need a universal health care. And you kind of find yourself hitting this brick wall where, unless you're able to convey that they're actually, for them to have the things they want, they need what they would consider a counterintuitive approach. So Dr. Edward Hudgens over here is talking about the potential for life extension, but I don't think anyone's going to get the potential of life extension technologies or healthcare. I would just simplify it as better healthcare, cheaper healthcare, like healthcare where we crush the prices, we make it more efficient, without a free market approach. And finding a way to disentangle the conversation from a lot of bias and kind of conversation trauma. People have very negative experiences with arguments and conversations going the wrong way at a Thanksgiving dinner. So a lot of people go, just don't talk about it at all. It's not worth it. Don't say who you're voting for. Don't talk about politics. It's better to talk about the weather or, movies. And I do think it's important to reach out to people and understand that a lot of people share the same interests, and they need to be able to diagnose problems correctly. Because if you have COVID, if you have coronavirus, but you're treating cancer, you're never going to solve the problem. And I do think there's a diagnosis problem when it comes to the problems with our infrastructure and healthcare. And the free market has to be explained as not a religious thing, which I do think the far left believes, oh, you believe in God or you're religious. Those are the people that typically believe in the free market. If I'm comparing two explanations, why should I choose the Austrian School of Economics explanations for how the economy works over the Keynesian explanations and the modern monetary theory explanations for economics? Like, how do you compare these things to the layperson?
But Jules, I think the main criticism is opening up a can of worms. The problem, I think, with an inherently libertarian system is that it's operating off of a 19th century version of power. The problem is nowadays we have very intangible market forces that are benefiting a lot of discourses that are very destructive to a lot of aims and people that are libertarians or on the right and so forth. The problem is it's almost inherently self-defeating when you have corporations themselves that are being imbued with social doctrines, hence the term woke capitalism. Because if we're going to have an apparatus of power that maybe isn't totally restricted by the government, but rather by corporations who are doing the jobs of the left for them, then I don't see a way libertarianism can address the current epoch of power right now that is diffused within a corporate / government / managerial state. That's my main contention. But another thing too, I don't think it's really postmodern, because postmodernism, I think, is almost libertarian in that it's a sort of a critique of meta-narratives. What we have now is almost I would say a secular religion, a moralism that has transcended all limitations of the certain sort of liberalism that was from the 19th century up to the 20th century. I wouldn't even call them postmodernists. I would say that they're very, there's maybe Marxism involved, but certainly I think that there's what we're seeing now with the wokes, it's a logical extension of that very system of liberalism that I think, unfortunately, libertarianism is wedded to. So I know, Jeffrey, that you're a Catholic libertarian, and I'm also Catholic, but I wonder what you think of this sort of framework. Like, how do you, when tech companies are willing to censor people, how is it that a libertarian system could prevent them from just getting rid of all dissent whatsoever?
Yeah, I put some thought into this. It's been, of course, enormously depressing for me to watch the decline and fall of these tech giants. I mean, Amazon, when we came out with our first book on the coronavirus back in April, Kindle and Amazon would not publish it. I mean, we got censored, and it took weeks of complaint. They finally put the paperback in print, but they wouldn't make the Kindle live. That took another 6 weeks. And so, and we've seen, some like high-end doctors, having their epidemiologists who are dissenting from this nonsense, having their YouTubes taken down, and friends of mine who built up huge followings on YouTube suddenly just having their whole lives.
Stefan Molyneux got rid of his archive like 12 years.
I know.
Or so,
I mean, I'm not a fan of the direction he started taking in recent years, but my God, we need information flows to be out there. Plus, it seems a little bit like robbery. You work for 10 years developing a following, and then suddenly just one day somebody just pulls the plug, and just shatters your whole life. It's been devastating for me to see the way this has happened among the tech giants. I think what we need is a much greater degree of competition within the tech fields. I mean, I don't think that the consolidation that we've seen taking place over the last 5-10 years is really a result of the free market. I think it's partially the patent system. It makes it very difficult for people to get in and climb up to and compete, because you're always facing terrible lawsuits. And that's another thing that's gone wrong in this country, is the litigation. It's just out of control. This is one of the reasons China is going to beat us in GDP in a matter of 5 years, because they don't have this problem. They don't have litigators going around suing everybody. You can hardly move in this country in the corporate world without getting sued for something. It's disgusting.
I think we should have how about a trade? We send over our lawyers, they send all their Hong Kong entrepreneurs. I think it's fair.
But
we're suing ourselves.
An exchange rate, one lawyer for.
But the big concern here is that these are all great
Wally
propositions.
Olson is an.
I just so quickly say.
By the way, I just want to call your attention. One of the audiences that I am appealing to with my Human Achievement Alliance. I'm not sure, Jeffrey, if you know Peter Diamandis and his work. He was one of the co-founders of Singularity University. Abundance is his kind of operation, and Peter is kind of he was the one who started the Space X Prize, a private prize, because he realized NASA just couldn't do it, and he wanted to see people go into space, so he got $10 million and so forth. He, in his books, and with Stephen Kotler, he says among his influences are Hayek, Ayn Rand. There's a lot of scientists in there as well. And I knew Peter from when I was doing space policy over at the Cato Institute. And there is not an underclass, what I'm looking for. There is an audience of folks who really want to cure diseases, who really want to do all these incredible things, who want to have flying cars, who want to do all of this kind of futuristic stuff. And they're free market oriented. They're probably what I call soft liberal. Maybe socially they're more libertarian. But I find that it's an audience that I have been engaged with, and I see them as potentially kind of leading the way into the future. Because first of all, they're sincere. I mean, look, we were talking about, how do you appeal to a liberal, say, on healthcare? And Jeffrey and I have both written stuff about this, and there's a lot of ways to do that. But if liberals really cared, for example, I live not too far from Baltimore, Maryland. Last year, I think there were only 360 murders compared to the year before. Chicago was 490 murders. I remember as a little kid watching Baltimore and Washington burn in 1968, and things have only gotten worse. If the liberals really cared about those people, We would have free choice. We would have in education.
But this is the big problem, though, because you're a brilliant guy,
issue.
and you and Jeffrey, you are brilliant individuals who I think are contributing a tremendous thing to the world. The big problem, though, is that when you are coming to people with reasonableness and with great things to say, and with, as Ben Shapiro likes to say, facts and logic, my concern is that a lot of these folks, they've already gone so much in the deep end of entropy that they don't care what you say. They care who you are. They care what your identity is. And because of that, facts and logic are not going to work. So when you're talking about people moving away from, let's say, your side to Stefan Molyneux, there was a meme with Stefan where it says, the time for arguments is over, where it's a dreary thought. But at the end of the day, like I brought up the example...
The age of the egg.
Yes, well, like I brought up the example of, how do we set the system up in such a way that all these great ideas would be able to flourish?
Well,
what if,
part of it...
Well, what if the only choice would be a Pinochet? And I'm really sad to even say something like that, but at a certain point, if people aren't going to care about any good ideas and any facts and
that's what Gio is basically saying, right? Why not strong-arm everybody into doing what I believe is correct, right?
Well, obviously,
I think Gio does say that from time to time. I think that is a horrible mistake.
But I think even
mistake.
Within libertarianism, there's.
I was an elected commissioner in a small town, Cottage City near Bladensburg, Maryland, right on the DC line, up until about 10 years, because just before my 2 9-year-old girls were born, I decided that I wanted to live in a safer community. This was the community where my grandfather lived. It was where my father grew up, a working class community. By the time I got elected as a town commissioner, it was majority Hispanic, Black, and there's some whites there too. And so I had to deal with a lot of these problems in Prince George's County, Maryland, on the ground, up close and personal. This wasn't me sitting in my academic chair talking about it in theory. And so I get a little bit of a perspective from that experience. And again, I lived in that community for many, many years. And what I saw was that there are a lot of sincere people who don't like the situation. Black, Hispanics, working class whites. That's where my background and my family is. And I see the opportunity to bypass the corrupt leaders, and I can point them out by name, by the way, here in the state of Maryland, if anyone is interested, and to go directly to the people. Now, that's not the path I have chosen as a full-time career for a lot of different reasons. But if we had more of what I would call a Jack Kemp Republican, Jack Kemp went into the projects in DC. You probably know this, Jeffrey. Went and worked with Kimmy Gray on, can't we take this decrepit public housing project and privatize the damn thing and make it your property? And if we had more, and by the way,
we can't do that without persuasion. So I want to pivot a little bit, and I want to ask Jeffrey a question, because I think it sounds like there's a lot more pessimism in this conversation at the moment than I think there should be.
Derek's volume is too loud. This has been noticed in the chat. Derek, is there any way that you can go further away? FYI. Anyway, go for it, Jules.
Yeah, I'll move it further away. Sorry.
So sometimes it can be exhausting to have the same conversations over and over again. But I think in New York, I've had so many rewarding experiences with aha moments where if you're able to disillusion people with their free healthcare idealism, you can then maybe scale up a conversation to how do we privatize more things. But as long as people shut down, not because of your identity, but because of really what they believe your message is, because I think it might seem on the surface like people are a lot less receptive just based on superficial reasons. I think people actually tend to be very intelligent. I think they tend to be very reasonable. And sometimes they're just a little over-conditioned through previous negative experiences, and they become deprived of constructive conversations. But Jeffrey, I just wanted to know, what would you say to someone that said, well, why don't we have healthcare like they have in Denmark or everywhere else in the world? I've heard people from the Young Turks say, essentially, the entire world has free healthcare, and America's the only place that doesn't have free healthcare. In fact, we spend more money on healthcare than the rest of the world, and it's completely unaffordable. How do you have that conversation to begin with?
There are a lot of free healthcare systems in the world that seem to work more or less. And I would point to, what did you say, Denmark? Yeah, sure. Sweden, Australia. Most of these countries, though, there's a few things to say about that. One is that they're mostly demographically homogeneous societies. So everyone is invited to think of everyone else as a kind of an extended family member. And under those conditions, a welfare state can be more or less politically viable. The other thing that's interesting about these countries is they have a tradition of, this is true for Canada too, of like believing in good government. They actually take pride.
Yeah, Canadians are fools for that, unfortunately. But
Geo's from Canada, by the way, FYI.
But they take pride in having good public services, actually. And there's a third thing, which is that in all these cases, they have an overlay of a public system for everybody, but then they have a private, mostly completely unregulated service that lives with very few restrictions underneath it. And,
That's right.
And so here's the thing. And none of those conditions apply in this country, right? We have a universally heavily regulated medical system that's kind of fascistically organized, heavily publicly funded, but egregiously regulated, far more so than the private systems in Australia, Denmark, and Sweden. We do not have a homogeneous population where Americans are invited to think of everybody else who's consuming public services as an extended family member. Not at all. People in this country are ready to slit each other's throat under the smallest pretext. If you look at what you're stealing money from me. I mean, a socialized system in this country of healthcare would turn everyone against everyone else, and it would collapse almost immediately. But the third thing is we actually don't have in America, and I think this is kind of okay, we do not have a tradition of believing in good government. We don't take pride in our public services. We mostly hate them. I mean, this country was founded in overthrowing a government. So we don't have, that's not part of our heritage. We have basically a libertarian heritage and libertarian outlook. So none of the conditions that make for a Sweden, a Denmark, or an Australia, or a New Zealand pertain to this country at all. I think, like, just on purely practical, not ideological grounds, purely practical grounds, a Bernie Sanders style single payer system in this country would be socially, economically, and medically catastrophic.
Well, based on what you said, it's really interesting, because I'm very anti Bernie Sanders, but I try to understand the best explanations and arguments of the other side. I'm not sure. It's in response to what you were talking about with being careful about your sources. I believe I learned this from Nassim Taleb. If you don't know your opponent's position, if you don't know other people's positions, you don't know your own position, right? And I always thought that was really interesting, that if you don't know other people's positions, you truly don't know your own position.
Get that from John Stuart Mill.
Oh, it probably was from John Stuart Mill.
Actually, even before that, Thomas Aquinas.
That's right.
That's right.
I've got my Aquinas sitting on the shelf over there. I can't pull it off right now. Sorry.
But it's interesting, though, because Jeffrey, you mentioned, and this covers what Dr. Hughes was saying a bit with technology and accelerationism. This may be a can of worms, but it seems interesting, the character of libertarian thought nowadays, because it seems that the libertarianism, you've heard of the theory of the pipeline, right? I think it's kind of spurious, but it's sort of true, because a lot of different strains of ideas came originally from that sort of Californian ideology, tech libertarianism,
right?
From Hoppe and Rothbard and anarcho-capitalism. From that came people like Mencius Moldbug, Nick Land, and there's still somewhat like remnants of Californian ideology, Silicon Valley libertarianism. But why is it that it seems that a lot of people, they sort of went to the alt-right. Now the alt-right's cringe, it's done, it's over, it's people clingers on like Richard Spencer, whatever. But it seems that a lot of people, because you mentioned demographics, a lot of people, they grew up in that libertarian moment, and they expressed themselves in it with Ron Paul, the Ron Paul movement, and so forth. And I was part of it. But it seems that a lot of people left because libertarianism, they felt like it wasn't addressing their specific concerns of identity and belonging, and so. But it's curious how that culture of tech libertarian, less wrong, gave birth almost to accelerationism, gave birth to Moldbugian neo-reactionary thought. So I wondered, do you know much about I guess you and Dr. Hughes, do you know much about accelerationism and neo-reaction and all that?
I actually, I really know more than I want to know about it. I wrote an entire book. It's been translated into Portuguese, Spanish, and the first chapter is in English. It's called Right-Wing Collectivism. And
I heard of this book, yes.
Yeah, the reason I wrote it is interesting because what I saw were going on around me was a bunch of libertarians almost inadvertently drifting into an ideological, what would you say, like a forest in which they got lost. They just kind of wandered in, didn't know where they were, and just kept exploring and exploring and exploring. Next thing you know, they're dabbling in Hegelianism, and now they've got a little bit of eugenic theory. Now they've got a little bit of race,
human biodiversity, and all that stuff.
Yeah, and then and they're next thing you know, they're pushing the ideas of Carlyle and Carl Schmitt, and just like it's a cesspool.
Why does it seem to always come from Hoppe? Why? I mean, it always. Yeah. Well, I mean, I've read some Hoppe, and I never really got that impression.
Hoppe's an interesting guy, but he himself was trained in a Hegelian tradition. So I don't think Hoppe ever preached alt-right doctrine, but he did open up, I think also inadvertently, by the way, opened up certain pathways that led, again, people to very naively wander into strange areas that didn't know where they were. The reason I wrote that book was to explain, well, let me just say, discover and then explain, that not all collectivism comes from the left. There's a variety of collectivism that also comes from the right also. And you can trace the development of these two strains of collectivist thought from the early 19th century. And both of them went in different directions, but both towards unparalleled paths towards the same kind of arguably totalitarian ends. And it's just that libertarians knew very much about the sort of the left socialist branch of thinking and where it came from and why it's bad, but they were very naive in a sense about the right version of totalitarianism, or right-wing collectivism, I called it, or really, I think more precisely, right Hegelianism. That's characterized as nationalism and protectionism, racial identitarianism. Theocracy is another branch of the same thing. And
red pill.
Yeah. So but the purpose of my book really was to introduce. Look, I try not to write for a libertarian audience, but look, that book is very nicely structured so libertarians can read it, to introduce libertarians into this. To explain to them, where they're headed and why ultimately where they're going with these kinds of ideological wanderings is into an illiberal path that we've tried before with catastrophic results in the 20th century, and actually even in the late 19th century. So that was the purpose of that book. So, I mean, I wrote it. I did not like writing that book, by the way. It was really a terrible experience for me, but I'm glad I did. And I hope it will continue to be of some value to people. Nothing I write will ever persuade anybody immediately. All you can really do is give food for thought. But I really hope, I think that book has done some good. My friend Elio Beltrão in Brazil tells me that the Portuguese, I went down there for a big book party when it came out in Portuguese, that it's made a huge difference in Brazil in terms of turning people away from Hegelianism towards more of a classical liberal position.
I have a question regarding this, and it also starts with a comment that Bruce Bach-Trotter, thank you for joining us in the chat, Bruce, has. We were all just following a charismatic leader. Ron Paul drove the libertarian movement, and Trump took his celebrity. The interesting thing to me here is that I think that to a certain degree, people who are brought up in a certain way, who have certain influences, who have, who knows what else, they end up thinking more independently. I am not sure how many independent thinkers there are going to be in comparison to those who are going to need some kind of a hierarchy to follow. Which brings me to the idea that if you deprive people of some kind of structure, whether it's the family, whether it's the local community, whether it's something else, then that is going to be a gap which will be filled in by other influences, like the media, like whatever things they happen to absorb on YouTube.
State.
Exactly, like the state.
Yeah.
That being said, what would be the solution here? Because it almost seems like it would be inevitable that there are always going to be people who are going to be following some elites. I believe in the horizontal elite. I believe that there's always going to be an elite, but how do you do it in such a way that the elite is going to not be one that's going to turn things into a bureaucratic hellhole, but one that would be able to influence people in a positive way? Or do you want to do away with the elites at all entirely, which to me would be really weird, because it would be, again, opening up a gap of influence for something else to go in that gap. So I would really love to hear your thoughts about that, Jeffrey. And
just one quick thought on that. Yes, leadership is inevitable. Hierarchy is part of the natural social order. There's bosses and there's employees. And if there's usually one person who's head of the family. It's complicated, right? There's also teamwork and cooperation. Just because I'm the boss of some people here at the American Institute of Economic Research doesn't mean they're my slaves or serfs. We work cooperatively towards something that's bigger than ourselves. But nonetheless, it's true that there would never be anything like sort of a perfectly egalitarian world. And I think it's okay, and it's good. The problem is when political leadership takes over the role of the sort of natural leadership that you get in a normal free society. That's why I always used to get the chills when Bill Clinton used to talk about the nation as a family. Oh yeah? What are you, you're the father? You're the father of this? You used to give me the creeps, like, and Obama was the same way. You'd always conceive of the nation as a big family. And it kind of, it's true for Trump too, right? He's this big father figure, it's this big leader. And I think that these people are basically what they're doing is taking a legitimate idea of leadership and elite and people that you admire and stealing it and subsuming it and corrupting it. The real leaders we should be appreciating in our society are intellectuals and scientists and philosophers and entrepreneurs.
They
like a
themselves have all
technocracy.
become corrupt, pretty much.
Yeah. By the way,
I have
I'll add to Jeffrey's point just very quickly. I mean, since I get to put on my philosopher hat here instead of my public policy hat, if you want to go back to Aristotle's Politics, which if I had a Bible, that would probably be a good one, talks about different kinds of communities, right? Yeah. And the family is a kind of community. There are different roles.
The originary community, yeah.
Yeah, and and I see that. I mean, we could of course tweak around with it now, but I mean, there are different kinds of communities, and of course, the U.S. Constitution appreciated that. That's why you have divisions of powers and so forth. You might have elites, so to speak, in a small town, and there are some people who might be a business person who also is kind of a community leader, someone people look up to, this and that and the other. You have it at different levels. You have a meritocracy, which is what Jefferson talked about.
That's the right word.
Yeah. Exactly, a meritocracy. But when you get into politicizing everything, that's when you really get into a problem. So it's not whether, and again, I could go through and I could tell you exactly the people in the state of Maryland here or in different communities who I think are really good, honest people, and who are really, I don't want to use four-letter words here because this is hopefully a family thing.
No, you can. But that's not a problem.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, also, I do have two little 9-year-olds running around peeking in my door, and I want to raise them in a particular way. Anyway, but the point here is that there are natural communities, and if you allow an open, free system to evolve, again, maybe this particular person is really a fount of wisdom on one thing. This other person is good at, helping individuals get along better. This person is better at helping innovators, right? And you got a good idea, you want to do it, and so on and so on and so on. And so that's the beauty of an open system. It's not just an open free market system, which is what our Frank Mises here outlines. It's an open civil society that allows for the best. I'm very good at some things. I'm not very good at other things. So hopefully I will rise and, be looked at as an authority on practical politics or stuff like that. But on other things, go to Jeffrey. He's better. He wrote the book on this.
Do you mind if I ask you a personal question? Or maybe not a personal question. I'm sorry. It's not personal, but ask what you personally think about collectively owned, I guess, normatively collectively owned property. Because I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I do think that collective property can be legitimate, but you have to have contracts up first to kind of agree on the terms of this before it's maybe homesteaded or bought or traded. I got into an argument the other day with somebody who believes that collective property can be homesteaded normatively without any communication between each other, like even using Lockean norms.
Is this question for me?
Yeah, I guess for either of you or whoever thinks it's interesting.
You mean like syndicalism?
Now that we're talking,
since
we're talking about collectivism and everything, I think this is because this has really been bugging me for like 2 weeks maybe, and I haven't really found a satisfactory answer. And I'm not really too sure. My instincts say that, by normal contract theory of title, transfer, it has to be the individual. Otherwise, like if the individuals aren't coordinating, you mind if I give it a quick example? Like Sure. This is the example that was given in this conversation before. There's a village and people walk a path to, let's say, I don't know, get to a water supply or something. They walk this path back and forth. Maybe you could just say like maybe one person walks the path a month. But there's a village of 50 people, so 50 people eventually walk this path back and forth, and a path does eventually form. It's very clear. You can see there's a path there. It has utility. It's practical. That it allows you to get from the village to the water supply. But no one really drew up a contract to say, okay, we each own this path in this way, and this is how the rights to this path should be allocated. I'm not. My inclination is to say that it shouldn't be considered owned property. That path, even though it has been naturally transformed or maybe even cultivated for permanent use or occupancy or whatever, if one person walked the path and then back, that's not enough to satisfy Lockean homesteading norms, right? But I mean, why is it that 50 people doing it and it just so happens to form a path? They never communicate that it's theirs. There's no explicit contractual terms here, or maybe even tacit contractual terms.
Yeah, there's nothing unusual about this. This is not a weird case. This is just part of reality. I mean, even around our acreage here, we have a lot of acres, but there are easements all over the place that are just part of contractual rights and part of people getting along. Look, before you think too hard about this, there's a lot of work on this already done. The top theorist in economics on the subject is named Elinor Ostrom, Ostrom, and she won the Nobel Prize for voluntary collective ownership of land and shared goods within the context of a market. And you can't script it, with Lockean rules or something like that. It really does emerge out of the natural interactions of humans.
Yeah. There you got Hayek.
Yeah, and Hayek too, right?
Spontaneous order.
Right.
But if I may like jump in a bit to defend reaction. Now, there's a lot of problems I think with the different subsects. Like, I'm not personally a white nationalist, or I think ethno-nationalism. There's a bit of a different case, but there's a problematization of it in America in particular. But the problem I think is that Jeffrey, I think you get the logic of people like, for example, Mencius Moldbug, where they say that it was the systemic sort of groundwork of liberalism itself that has led to a lot of modern conditions of atomization and alienation and what he would call the ultra Calvinism of these woke institutions, the cathedral, what have you. It seems that the decentralization of power has only benefited a lot of these the modern ennui that we find the conditions we find ourselves in modernity. And there's an argument. It becomes problematic when you label it Hegelian, because of course I think a lot of them they take inspiration from people like Maistre and Schmidt and Heidegger. There's a bit of Hegelianism in there, but that's a technical issue. But I think maybe to ask you more bluntly, what do you think about the Schmittian friend-enemy distinction? There will always be a friend-enemy distinction. It's the founding mythos of every collective in civilization, and to want a global Ancapistan, or a global, even one world communism on the other side, it's near impossible, because there's always going to be these brute facts of human nature. So maybe that's my sort of hot take on defending neo-reaction a little bit. Of course, I think that neo-cameralism is a very untenable system for a variety of reasons, but sorry, I'm just going off. So
yeah, you don't probably want to know my views on Carl Schmitt, but but you do need to remember that his bête noire is Benjamin Constant, right? So Benjamin Constant was early 19th century liberal thinker who I think understood liberalism better than anybody since Adam Smith. And a core point about liberalism is precisely what Schmitt rejected, which is that we can cooperate and mutually trade and create harmony, social harmony between people, and that this is the very essence of what it means to be a modern person in the sense of a post-enlightenment kind of person. So that we understand that people can have shared interests. They can serve themselves while serving others in a cooperative way. Now, Schmitt hated that idea because he thought it would make life too boring. And that really what the essence of life is, to have a big dramatic lives in which we're slitting other people's throats, whose guts we hate. And Schmitt was actually really careful to say, it doesn't matter who the enemy is, as long as there is an enemy. And he added, as long as there's blood associated with eneminess, right? So he did not mean you don't like people. He thought it was important that the enemies be really really enemies, like legitimate. And this is just a quote from his book, The Idea of Politics, I believe. And so I think it's an important book to read, by the way. I think everybody should read it, because if you as a liberal, when I say liberal, I mean classical liberal, if you can't withstand his critique, you've got some learning to do. So I think it's an important book, and everybody should read it and come to terms with it. And I think this is what you're putting your finger on, I think, is the fundamental objection that people have to the idea of freedom, ultimately, is that they think it's just too uneventful. It's too bourgeois.
There's one thing I would add, though.
I think maybe
freedom.
people abuse. Yeah.
Well, this is what I'm getting to. There is a meme on the internet with this boomer grilling guy who says, like, "Let me grill, for God's sakes." And this is the only thing this guy wants to do, this cartoony-looking chef guy. And the idea here is that while I would have no problem living in that kind of society, the Enlightenment society you're talking about, the problem goes back to if you can keep it. And that points to all the things I've been saying earlier about the chaos that always kind of intrudes upon a good system when you get these activist judges, when you get all these commies who come out of the woodwork, who invade the institutions, who invade academia, and then what do? So if we are, and I'm not saying we are, but if we may be in a situation like the how was it in ancient Rome? The Optimates?
Octavarian?
No, the Optimales.
The Optimates and the Populares.
Exactly. So if we're in that situation, what happened back then? We had Julius Caesar and then Augustus who came in and cleaned house and created order out of chaos. I don't want that to happen. I don't want there to be any violence or bloodshed or anything like that. I'm completely against that. But to be an incredibly realistic here, what really are the choices down the line right now? What do we have to work with?
So,
Can I?
so hold on. I want to add an asterisk while we're talking about the Romans. One of my favorite anecdotes about the Romans came from Skin in the Game, Nassim Taleb's book about bridge builders. So Roman bridge builders had to sleep under their bridge because if it collapsed, the bridge builders were the ones that suffer the consequences. And I think when people talk about this accelerating future, and you have Noah Yuval Harari talking about the potential for an AI bureaucrat, which could create a one world government, I think people misunderstand Hayekian dynamics and the nature of emergence and how things that previously didn't exist just emerge in the market. And so I think that people the reason why people starve in Africa is not because we don't produce enough food. It's because we can't transport food from point A to point B efficiently. So Yuval Noah Harari frames the problem as we're either going to have a one world government or all the nations are going to be competing strongholds. And I think this is a false dichotomy. I think it would be much more productive if you thought of all different nations as nodes or quench points in a network. And so how do we open up the flow of information or just the channels of whether it's financial transactions or how do you make it easier for people to cooperate so that more value can be put into our systems so that a rising tide raises all ships. And now, Jeffrey, you were talking earlier, also when you were talking about Bernie Sanders, you mentioned people being contentious and just seeing each other as enemies. And it sounded to me like when you were talking about healthcare systems in other countries, it almost sounded like you were conceding and you were talking about how our social fabric or our history doesn't lend itself to what the far left might argue is a better, more utopian situation. And I disagree. And I think that, just to finish collecting my thoughts, I think that it's important to talk about scale. And I think Hayek sort of intuitively understood scale problems in a way that Nassim Taleb says economists sometimes don't understand. And I don't think that's true. I think you have to just be able to listen to everyone. But just like a family of 3 behaves differently than a family of 10, which would behave differently from a family of 20, right? And same with companies. A startup company of 10 people is different than 500 people, is different than 1,000 people. America, we have about 300 million people. So I don't think it's just a social fabric or history problem. I also think it's a scale problem, which is also why I think a one world government would be so problematic, not because of social fabric or history, but because it would be a breakdown in complex systems. It would cause a breakdown in complex systems.
Yeah, that's part of it. But part of the problem with scaling is encountering heterogeneity. You know, if you can scale much easier under homogeneous parts, but if every new thing added to the scaling problem is different from the previous thing, then you do get a system-wide breakdown, and that's exactly what would happen in this country. By the way, I don't want to defend socialized medicine in Australia, Denmark. I think all these systems should be completely private, and I think, by the way, we can have universal healthcare availability under a purely private market, but it has to be unregulated.
But why isn't that callous? Why is it not callous to say that all healthcare should be private?
I don't understand why the word callous and private is. What's
hey, this is private. This is private. The fact that we're having this conversation is all because private companies decided to work out of their garages in an unregulated manner to produce all this cool stuff that we're doing.
Yeah, I don't
know. Internet technology had a lot of DARPA and things like that.
I'm well aware of the history, but it wasn't just the fact that DARPA put money into it. It was the fact that you have people who were entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs and whatever. And we've just said,
Gentlemen, I have a 4:30 interview. I have to hop on. I'm so sorry.
Oh, Jeffrey, just one quick question before you go. Okay. What I was asking right before Jules was talking, which I almost forgot what I was asking in the first place, but what it was what is the inevitability you think down the road if we're not able to convince people that these wonderful things that I think are indeed wonderful would be able to happen if we all work together?
I think we've seen over the last 6 months what happens when you unleash the total state. And actually, I think we're facing an epic moment right now. We're coming out of the most highest, most stringent imposition of government controls that any generation's faced in, I don't know, a very long time. Do we like it? I don't think so. And I'm hoping when we come out of this lockdown situation, we're going to embrace liberty as never before. In fact, I might as well tell you, I'm finishing up, that's what I was doing this morning, a book called Liberty or Lockdown. We face a choice and we're going to have to choose one or the other. I think once you give governments power, they're going to use it and abuse it. And we can't tolerate that anymore. So we've got to become, I think, evangelists for human rights and for liberty, and to help steer the conversation as we open up the economies and make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. There's no certainty, but I think we actually do have a real opportunity right now to make a difference, because people are listening and people are looking for answers. This is a good time for us, I think. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you so much for having me, and
Jeffrey,
invite me back, please.
I would love
Jeffrey, thank you so much for coming. Loved having you.
Take care.
Bye.
And everybody,
have a great day.
Don't forget to subscribe and go to patreon.com/breaktherules, and you will get an exquisite print from Giovanni Panicetti, brilliant artist. Thank you guys so much for coming in. This was an incredible interview, and we will see you all later.